Good afternoon, everybody. We're live. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Bo. Hey, everybody. Welcome
Hello.
to another A-Team hangout here. Today we have a special guest. We have Andrea Trout with us. She is with Legacy Group, and she's an expert on project management and project vetting. So we brought her on. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you.
And as part of the GCA team, we have Barry
Good
Jakowski.
afternoon, everybody. We're live. Oh, no. Hello, Tom.
Oh, hey, everybody.
Hey.
So, Barry,
Hey, hi, everybody.
Yep. And then we have Jennifer.
Hello.
And we have Mandy.
Hi there.
And Bo, our technician here, and leader of the project management team as well. So, we are, the plan for today is vetting the deals. This particular section we're in right now is vetting the project for private lending. And I think last time we left off on the final contractor bid, is that right? And we are moving on to permits required as our section, as our first slide. And this is all part of a checklist that we put together. Bo and Mandy have led the way on the original checklist, and it's a lot of the things that we've learned over the last years in the private lending business as well as in the construction business. Bo and Mandy have been in for, well, together probably a little over 50 years, maybe even more. And the whole team here has been in real estate construction of some sort for quite some time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Barry, do you just want to share the thoughts on the question?
Sure. Before I do that, even Tom, just in case any local people are listening, you have your meetup tonight. Tom, you want to tell everyone about that at Harry's Hofbrau?
Sure. Yeah, we have every Tuesday, every second Tuesday of every month, we have our what we call the Bay Area Private Money for Real Estate Investors meetup. And that is at Harry's Hofbrau. It's at 7 o'clock. Usually lasts a couple hours, goes into about, sometimes it'll go to about 10:30 with all the networking at the end, but it's a very open, very casual meeting. No charge for it, but it's a lot of good networking. The last meetings we've been getting about 100 people there per meeting, and so really love to have anybody who's in the area join us and help us make it another good meeting. So this evening we have an attorney that's going to be talking about different entity structuring. So
it is very impressive, the meetup, as far as the meetups I've been to. So if you haven't attended, I recommend it highly. What Tom was talking about is on your screen, usually on the left-hand side of your screen, you can open up a little app that is questions and answers. And the way this webinar really works best is if you guys just send in questions or comments, and I'll read the comments or questions, or someone else will, and we'd like to include you throughout the whole, throughout the entire hangout. That and we find the more you can do that, the more lively and the better the hangout is. So we all invite you to ask any of us questions or just questions on the topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. All right, so let's jump in with permits. Permits required. Again, the idea here is that it's an item on the checklist. It requires us to look at the item, and with that item, the permits required, it causes us to think through the process, and we've added a few bullet points beneath each of the check items as some things that are worth thinking about as we go through them. Could one of you share the differences between over-the-counter and what's the opposite of over-the-counter permits? I always call them discretionary or non-discretionary. Sorry, Mandy, what was that?
Full submittal.
Oh, full submittal. There. Would you care to share your thoughts on that and the differentiation?
Yeah. Typically,
when there's any structural work that needs to be done, when you're submitting for plans, you're going to have to do a full submittal where they're going to require a full set of drawings with a plot plan, your elevations, the floor plans. If it's a renovation, then they're going to want to see what they call the as-built, which were the before, the existing, and then the new addition or the walls that you're changing on the plan. So, and then you're going to have some different, I think it's in the bullet point there, structural engineering and whatever. Anything like that that is going to require more than somebody just checking something literally over the counter, where you've got a little hand drawing and saying, all I'm doing is moving maybe one little wall here. They're going to require what they call a full submittal, which can take anywhere from, I don't know, maybe 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the city or county that you're submitting in and the extent of the work. Over the counter, literally as you go in with your little hand drawings, and usually there's very little documentation, and they will issue a permit to you right then and there. So it really depends on the scope of work that you're submitting for.
So Mandy, what might be a couple of examples of over-the-counter permits that one might find?
Pretty common is if you are wanting to change out a water heater, maybe the HVAC system, you're upgrading that. If you're putting in replacement windows in an existing house, those are typically the smaller items. Maybe you might get away with if you're doing some minor plumbing changes in a kitchen, for example, if you're moving the placement of appliances and maybe some of the plumbing, the sink. As long as you're not doing anything structural, then you could probably get away with an over-the-counter permit.
Okay. And maybe Andrea, could you do you have any thoughts on, or anything you can share with us on who the people are that are involved in the permitting process at the municipality or on our end as the contractors?
Well, generally, you have to be the contractor to get it, unless you're owner-occ. Some places you can go pull it as an owner-occupant, which gets interesting when it's an investment property. You know, because again, like she's saying, it's for a lot of times it's not the big deal stuff as the over-the-counter permit. So, you know, if you don't necessarily want to have to pay a full-blown GC to do that on some deals, if it's a very small deal and your guy is a handyman but he doesn't have that, he might get away with it depending on the municipality. I don't know about California. My experience with that is pretty limited to Colorado because, you know, in California, Greg vets all that for us. But here, you know, we've done it a few times where when we were fixing and flipping, where Matt would go as the owner or Randy would go as the owner, and they can pull it as the owner, and then we get the permit, get it done. But, you know, I don't necessarily recommend that for somebody, you know, you want, if they know what they're doing and that's part of the vetting process of that borrower, it may be okay if it's a very easy flip, you know. But what we're doing in California tends to not be that kind of a situation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Bo, would you mind just sharing a little bit about who on the engineering side, what that might look like when you're working with the municipality, the city, the county, whoever is issuing permits?
Well, typically you're going to, depending on, you've got structural engineering, you've got the soils engineer. Those are the two primary. You can get into some who just places are going to end up, you know, they could require an HVAC design by a licensed HVAC contractor, depending on, you know, it could, you know, if it's residential, commercial. I think the biggest thing is there's, depending on the city or the county, there could be all kinds of different requirements, different levels of requirements, even to the point where, depending on who comes in to get the permit, it could determine whether they get one over the counter or they don't because they know somebody. But besides the architectural plans, the structural engineering and soils engineering, are probably the two
Okay.
ones. And then, arborists reports can get involved,
Mm-hmm.
and planning departments and.
And sometimes not as far as engineering, but when permits are pulled, a lot of times the fire department is plans and specs are reviewed, and I don't remember if we have that in a different section here, but even things like fire department review, because they need to know that if there's any addition going on or any major construction going on, they want to know that they've got the proper access and that type of thing. Any comments on that?
Yeah, Tom, also relative to that, in California, there maybe in other states too, but they're looking at how much water, the fire department is looking at how much water is being used even for the landscaping. They'll review the landscaping plan before even issuing certain permits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and here in California, any new construction requires automatic sprinkler system in the home, so that's another step you have to go through before you actually submit your plans to the building department, or while you're in a preliminary plan check there, you have to have your plans approved with the sprinkler system. And I had a project about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a new construction project in a neighborhood that had no fire hydrants in the neighborhood, and everybody was on well water, even though it was a well-developed neighborhood. So we had to go through all kinds of loops there to make sure that we had proper driveway access for the fire trucks to come in. And not only did we have to have the well tested for the sprinkler system, but we had to have a 500-gallon holding tank. So that was, a lot of extra costs that the homeowner was not anticipating at the initial time.
Right. Good points. Good points. I don't recall. I think, Andrea, you mentioned GC, and then which I just wanted to make sure everybody knew general contractor, and then Bo, you had mentioned HVAC, or maybe Mandy, I'm not sure, one of you, and that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, just for anybody who may not have those.
And so, Tom, when you when you guys use your builder's control, do they do some of that checking for you? Because I know Greg does that for us. Like, he'll actually go to the the entity that issues the permits to find out what is going on with that property and make sure that the proper steps have been taken and what will be required. And it goes back to what Bo said. We've had this experience on one project where the civil engineer was swapped out during the project, and that made a big difference because that civil engineer was the one who had the connections to get that deal done quickly. And guess what? Those connections, when that civil engineer were swapped out, it can cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, that you really have to, if you're not locally and you can't go down there yourself and find out what it's going to take to get that permit, you really need to rely on the feasibility study in advance from Builders Control and let them go down and figure it out.
Yeah, and I would add to that, but make sure that that is part of the tasks on the Builders Control or Construction Control contract, so that they know that that is part of what they are. That's part of your requirement for them to do, and that would be to do the.
They have a box they can check off.
Some of them do. Greg does, I'm sure.
Well, no, I'm sure there's some people that need that box to be able to check off, right?
Oh, absolutely,
for the scope, and that's not a slam. It's just that's how they work.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Tom, that leads to it almost answers completely Kelvin's question. He asked at the permitting phase, will the construction control company be involved in that? And we all know that the construction control is involved in it way before we even get to the permitting phase. They're looking at that, when they're doing the first feasibility study, looking at, at are permits even necessary and what types. But any of you guys want to answer more?
Great. And I would just add to that, my only point before was that just make sure that whoever you're using for construction control has that as an item on their checklist, because ask me how I know. I had a project where the construction control company went out, did the inspections, and later we found out that the permits weren't pulled. We made the assumption that that was part of their review. Well, that was early on, and now we know that with everyone. Just make sure it's on that to-do list.
Speaking of assumptions, Tom.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I had a borrower tell me, well, actually, first I know better than to, not go to the source. So I spent 45 minutes talking to a planner, and it's worth spending 45 minutes. Even, and Mandy will attest to the two people that were sitting behind me, and one of which gave us a dirty look and left the building because I kept asking more and more questions. And in the end, the ultimate question was, can we reuse the soils report and the arborist report when these plans get resubmitted, even though they were submitted before and approved? And the answer was no, you're going to have to get new updated reports. Prior to that, the person who was going to do the submittal told me that that was not going to have to happen, that they could reuse the reports, they'd been done before, and I went back and I said, well, that's not what I'm being told, and he wanted to argue with me, and so he in turn didn't follow through, and he's now finding out he does need new soils report, he does need a new arborist report, and he wastes weeks of time.
Absolutely. Yep. Never assume in this business.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question to the experts on the panel? If you're getting into a project and you realize that some of the things that were previously done to the house that you assumed were going to be good, you realize that the permits were never pulled, or the work could possibly come to light that it wasn't done correctly, is that ever an issue, or is that kind of water under the bridge?
I think
I would say in California it certainly is an issue. So
You have to fix it. I mean, if they find out, if they come into the house and they see that there are illegal issues, then you're going to have to correct them. So you should know that. Hopefully you know that going in, and that again comes to your feasibility study, your builder's control. Hopefully, when they do their inspection, they're looking really closely at all of that. But you can't take that for granted, can you?
it is a state-by-state thing. I have seen states where it isn't an issue, but in California it absolutely is. So, Bo or Mandy or Andrea, any thoughts on that?
I think it's always in your best interest, everybody's in best interest, to make sure that everything is permitted, and especially if sometimes there are discrepancies in the square footage size of an existing building, and you may discover that there was an addition done that was not permitted, so it's not included in the existing square footage. Well, every bit of added square footage you have is to your benefit, because it's going to add value to the after repair value. So in that case, absolutely, I would, if I found out something, even though it was wired, it looked like it was wired correctly, I would have that inspected so that we could get that permitted, and that would go on the county records. So we, in fact, added extra value to the property, because that 400, 500 square feet that wasn't on the tax roll before is now added. So that, in that case, it's an added bonus. And in rehabs, you run across that, especially in older homes where there's been additions over a period of years. That's not an uncommon thing to find.
Okay.
There's another question here, and it's from Kelvin again. For the environmental study reports, if they are already done by the previous owner, as a policy, should we redo them, or can we use them as they are? Oh, you sort of were, talking to that a little bit before.
I'm sorry, I was busy.
Oh, anyone else?
If it's, I'm wondering if he's referring to, like, for instance, a Phase 1 environmental report, and I think that's really going to be at the lender's discretion. I've seen where where other lenders will allow as long as it's relatively current, a phase one environmental report that was not specifically ordered by them.
And what about the city, Tom? What about the city? If the previous owner already had the environmental studies, done as a policy, should would they be even accepted?
Well, I don't know. Does the city require phase one environmental reports?
Actually, I wrote that note on there more so as a I don't think it's gotten to it yet, but I only know locally here in California, but it's getting pretty bad. The whole issue with abatement of asbestos and lead-based paint, and there's inspectors out there, and there's state and federal agencies, all trying to put a stop to people tearing all this stuff out and throw it away in improper locations. But it's just going to continue to get worse. So it's almost like beware. It's almost like a permitting process, even though maybe they don't do it over the counter. But don't let your job get shut down because your contractor's out ripping out asbestos and the neighbor comes in and calls somebody and shuts your job site down. So
and that's happened in Denver. It's not anybody we've lent to, but it's somebody that is a friend of one of our borrowers, and he didn't get the asbestos study. He just went in and started doing the rehab. Pissed the city off. They came by in the night, took samples from his dumpster, came in and red tagged him the next morning and shut him down to the point where that project was no longer profitable. And the fines for that too, and I don't even remember what they are, but there's both federal fines as well as then state fines for the asbestos now, and it's astronomical. And so it really is an issue that your borrower and your general contractor need to be aware of. And to answer Kelvin's question on that, he did say he's looking at a phase one, but once you do the mitigation on asbestos, I believe you're good. If you have the report that says that's been mitigated in that house, you don't have to do anything going forward at that point for asbestos, because you said you've had it tested by the people that charge you all this money to test it. You've mitigated it, and you should be good going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you're right. Those red tags happen, and they're expensive.
The fine on lead-based paint, I think, is something like $28,000 or $32,000.
Well, they're daily fines. Daily.
Daily, right? Yeah.
They compound daily.
Right.
Wow. Kim had a question also here. Maybe you guys, I don't completely understand it, but to what extent do you do the reports? She goes on to say apartments and commercial do all three, but that's overkill for San Francisco, 1 to 4 units.
Single family. Single family, 1 to 4 units.
Yeah, that's probably. Does anyone, Kim? Does anyone understand that question, or should we have Kim rephrase it maybe?
I didn't quite catch it.
I think she's asking about, like, do you do a phase one for single family 1 to 4? Because typically with apartments and commercial, you do phase one. I don't know what all three she's talking about. Right. All three reports. Maybe she can clarify.
Yeah, that'd be great, Kim. If you could do that, that would be awesome.
Well, I mean, in residential, it would be like soils reports and arborist reports. It's going to be general like that. In commercial, it's going to be phase one, phase two, which would be apartment buildings, commercial buildings. And then as far as the asbestos and lead-based paint, that's a matter of testing before you do demo and being aware that you need to hire a contractor that's licensed to be able to do those tasks. And just watch out, eventually the cities are going to require those tests if they don't already before you even get a permit, I would think. Eventually that's going to evolve.
And Jace is telling us that older homes be wary of in-ground oil tanks for environmental concerns. It's a good point, Jay.
Yep.
Yep.
Really good, especially on the East Coast,
Yep.
where you have lots of oil and oil furnace use.
Mm-hmm. I would just add, bigger risks for asbestos would be the siding issues. Wouldn't you agree? Either siding or the insulation around ductwork in the around furnace ductwork, that type of thing.
And popcorn ceilings.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm. So unless it's tested, it can.
One thing that one of our guys here in Colorado said, he said typically the siding isn't always an issue, and the reason for that is because it's encapsulated. It's the stuff that, like the insulation and the popcorn, where it can fly around. That's when you have the issues.
Yeah.
And the drywall.
Yep. Okay. Any other comments on those sections?
Kelvin also said, made the statement that for new construction of a single-family house, soil report is required, which is true. Very, very true.
Yeah. Good. All right. Any other comments from the group or from the outside listeners? All right. Then we go on to permits and delays.
Delays?
Yeah. Who would like to tackle that one?
Yeah, where do you start with that? No.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Process is a delay.
So just for a little clarity here, the Planning Commission. So well, maybe can one of you share Andrea, can you kind of describe the differences between the different departments and the process? Like, for instance, if we go from raw land, it has to go in. It has to be rezoned properly. If it's farmland, it'll have to be rezoned to whatever the new use is. Then it goes into planning, and then can you share just a little bit of the details around that?
You know, I probably know enough on that to be a little dangerous.
Okay.
You know, you have to get your tentative map approved with planning. So you go through that process. Yeah, it's better if you have somebody else do that one. I'm sorry. Again,
Okay.
I know enough to be dangerous.
Mandy, Bo, either one of you?
Well, the planning is your planning commission, right? It's usually in a city or county, and it's a group of people that have band together to stop, growth and people building things that they shouldn't be building, and keep control of architecture and design and meet all the changing guidelines that the city or the state and feds put down on them as far as controlling, mapping communities and controlling environment and the roads and traffic and all the issues that get involved in designing subdivisions and lot development and protecting the community. And so you've got this board sitting out there, and in front of the board is the Planning Commission, where you walk up to the counter and they've got the big black book that they pull out when you come up with your parcel number, and they pull out the book and say, well, our book says you have to do this, 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 and this. And if you haven't done that, you get to turn around and leave.
Right.
With your plans.
So they give you the application, you come back with everything that they want you to have in place so that you can get in line for somebody on their staff to put together a report on everything that you thought you had but are still missing. And at that point, maybe you've got everything, maybe you don't. So they're there just basically accumulate all the information and then end up getting on a schedule to go to the Planning Commission.
Yeah, exactly.
Approve or disapprove.
What they're looking for is kind of the compliance. Like if it's an individual lot that you're building on, say within the city, we have a project right now that we're working on that we're trying to get into and through Planning Commission. So they want to look and make sure that they'll look at your plot map, and they want to make sure that you are building within the easements, so the setbacks, side, front, rear easements. They want to look at the overall height of the building, so they want to make sure that they'll typically have, you know, a maximum height limit, and they'll look at your elevation to make sure that you're not exceeding that. If your building is, then you may have to submit what they call a variance to see that if you can get permission or an exception to build taller than that. But basically, they want to make sure that you're in compliance with all the guidelines within the city. They're not going to necessarily critique the actual design of the house. They may do, because that could go to another step where you've got a homeowners or an architect review committee within a neighborhood that's going to take that to the next step, and they're going to really critique your plans architecturally and determine. They want to see color boards. They want to see the exterior materials that you're putting on, and make sure that that conforms with the list that's in the other black book.
Right.
And our experience right now with this one client that we're working with, the Planning Commission process is taking 4 to 6 months to get approval just for that phase. That's before we even go into the building department and go through the whole building review on the plans, which is another, 4 weeks potentially. So that's something that we have to be very aware of up front, planning the time frame for how long before you actually decide that you're going to do this project to when you can actually pull the permit and start construction.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that if you ever want to get if you get tired of TV and you want to have a fun time watching an event, it could be a planning and zoning meeting or a planning committee meeting where and they have a tendency to not want sort of the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. I've seen some really interesting exchanges of discussions. Every once in a while, you'll see a big topic on TV where they might show that, but that actually is not some pretty heated discussions when it comes to planning and zoning issues. And so,
like, do you want recreational pot shops in your town in Colorado?
Mm-hmm.
That was a very heated discussion, and it's a matter of maybe not in my backyard.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And you just sometimes you really I've been to probably over 100 meetings, I'm sure, over the years, and where I was actually presenting, and only a couple of times was there really anything that had opposition. But you really, unless you really take the time and do a lot of homework and make sure you're presenting your plan, and this is generally more so with when you're getting into the development of land and whatnot. But the more prepared you are, the less likely you're going to have those issues. And a lot of times you may even want to go. The next one says neighborhood opposition. A lot of developers, and I've done this, where you really go out and you talk to every single neighbor that the city is required, or the municipality or the county, whoever is in charge, is required to give notice to people within a certain distance of a property. And it depends on what they're applying for. And so sometimes it could be people within a half a mile. Sometimes it's only people within a quarter mile or 2 or 3 blocks. But depending on what the issue is, you can have neighbors there that just, they may have no problem with it, but there might be one in there that'll just totally throw it off track. So being prepared, getting those questions answered before the meeting is really, really important. If you're going for, and this will typically happen in residential, it'll usually be if you're going for a variance, and that might be like a side yard setback variance. Instead of a 30-foot setback, you're going for a 20-foot setback. And those are the types of things. And sorry, I'll just take one more step there, and that is that goes back to the discretion discretionary and non-discretionary permits. The discretionary permits are the ones where the neighborhood could easily be invited or could easily be part of that decision-making process, or at least have input, so that when the deciding board makes their decision, they've got the input from those people. So just a few things to watch out for. It can get to be pretty exciting watching some of that stuff.
And that's something too, like with commercial, for instance, if there's ever property that you're going to have anything in like a liquor license, you actually, at least in Colorado, you have to pay somebody to go do a survey of those neighbors, but that's not the city that does that. That's your part of your expenses, the business owner. You have to pay to get a survey of whether those neighbors want that liquor establishment to be, you know, across the street from their house.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in an older area, like some of the ones in Colorado Springs are. So.
Yep. Thank you. Anybody have questions out in the audience?
This one goes back from Matt. It goes back to the environmental issue, and he said, I believe you would not want to be on title if an environmental issue is a liability, and it is based on ownership. So what if the loan is a non-performing one? Would you want to avoid taking the property back? Good question.
Would you want to avoid you broke up right at the end.
Oh, would you want to avoid taking the property back if there's an environmental issue that you find out, and then you know, and of course that could be based on ownership. How would you handle that?
I would certainly be careful, because when that property is signed back, you're taking on responsibility for that project. So I mean, it's a balancing the risk, in my opinion. So you got to do the research to find out what are the options, but it's not necessarily just automatically to take a property back if that is the case. At least that's my opinion. Anybody else want to share?
I know there's a super fund that's out there that protects people that really weren't the creator of the problem, so they don't get stuck with a problem like that. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it will lighten the load if there's a major cleanup or something on the property. So
I did have
just make sure that's an option before you go on title to that property,
right?
Because you don't want to be stuck with that cleanup.
Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly what I did with a property that I had. It was a corner property in my hometown that had been a gas station. Everybody knew it was a gas station forever, and there was even an issue with underground leakage, and so we knew what the case was. But I made sure that we had access to that super fund in order to help with the mitigation. I think they ended up covering about $120,000 worth of the land mitigation. And really, what they do, they dug out hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of the soil that was there, the contaminated soil, took it off to another site where they treated it, and they brought in clean soil, and then we built a strip mall on it. But I mean, it took a lot of upfront work to know that the value was in the property and that it was worth doing that based on the expense that it would take to get the project done. And without that Superfund assistance, the project would have never been viable, and it may still be sitting there today, 20 years or 15 years later, with contamination. So.
A lot of questions today about environmental. Here's one from David also. He said, he asks, how old of a house do you need to be concerned about with asbestos and things like old electrical where it all has to be replaced and things like that? What David asks.
1978 is kind of the key year cutoff for at least lead-based paint, and I think most of that asbestos probably coincides with that pretty close.
Yeah, I remember, well, maybe aging myself here, but I remember a lot of lawsuits and, or a lot of talk on the radio about the Crosby iron mines up in northern Minnesota, because that's where they did all the asbestos mining, and or the mining for the product for asbestos. And I think it was right around the late 70s, I believe. If anybody in the audience knows for sure, but I think anything into the 80s, it's less likely that it would have been used.
I know.
Oh, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
Officially, 1978 is the cutoff of, as far as what the EPA is quoting. If you've got a house older than 1978, you need to be testing. You know.
Okay.
Kim suggested, this is really awesome, thanks Kim for this suggestion. She said one resource is to check nextdoor.com for the area of the community your project is in. You'll learn a lot about the crime, environmental stuff at issue, called nextdoor.com.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks Kim for that.
Thank you, Kim. Anyone else want to share on that topic? Otherwise, we'll go to plan check or resubmittal. Mandy, do you want to do the plan check one?
Sure. Oh, sorry. I thought Bo was going to say something. So plan check is, you know, if you got the thumbs up from Planning Commission, if you had to go through that process. Also, you know, any HOA review, anything like that. Once your plans are all stamped from the outside municipalities, then your plans go to the building department for plan check. And like I said earlier, it really depends on the municipality. Sometimes you're going into the local city, sometimes you're going at the county level, and that's something that you need to check up front, to which municipality is responsible for the plan checking of those particular plans based on your address. The process can take anywhere from 2 to 4, maybe even 6 weeks. The whole idea of this is that you go in as fully prepared as you can be, because you don't want to have to go in for a resubmittal, because it's just going to take you back and set you back probably another 2 weeks. So you want to make sure that your contractor is going in with, you know, a complete set of plans. All the structural engineering is complete. The plans have been stamped by all the other agencies reviewing them and approved. Your energy calcs, your soils reports, your arborist reports, everything that you need, handed in, ready to go. And that way you stand at about a 90% chance of getting through. There may be a couple of what we call redlining of the plans during the process, and that's probably, say you're in a 4-week window, so maybe 2 weeks into the process somebody's actually physically sat and reviewed the plans. They may redline them a little bit. They'll typically contact the contractor responsible for submitting them. They will come pick up the plans, make those changes. There may be some re-engineering, typically not much, and then you can take the plans right back in. You go right back into the front of the queue, and then usually within another week or so you'll get the call to say that your plans are ready to pick up, and plans are stamped, and all you got to do then is pay the permit fee and you're ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
That's in an ideal world.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of these things we're covering is there are items that a contractor needs to know and needs to do. So we as lenders, it's not that everyone as a lender needs to know all of these things, but the more that as a lender, the more that we know how the process works and what's all involved, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to help the borrower head off any issues. Maybe let them see the flags before they do become issues. And so I want to go through at this sort of level of detail. I wanted to just share the thought of that sometimes with permits, we've done this only a couple of times, but when one goes in for a permit, when a borrower goes in for a permit, if he's not the owner of the property, a lot of times that municipality won't work with him. So what's a way to get around that, or to work with it even? And that would be maybe having that, suggesting that borrower, or maybe I'm saying that wrong, but one way of doing it, I guess I should say, is to have the borrower be a very minority membership holder in the entity that owns the property. And by doing that, then it's that entity that the borrower can show he has connection with, and then he can get in, at least in some areas, he can get in earlier before the property is actually turned over into that borrower's name. It can save a lot of upfront, a lot of interest because of the cost of money during the time that the permits are being issued, or it can be just a way of it's a way of buying time. So has anybody here worked on something that way? Okay. So anyway, that's a possibility if you're trying to cut your time down for your borrower. And then I just wanted to share one other thing, and this was a question that Carol Hart had asked. I think it was in relation to one of the. It might have been something that we brought up on Saturday at the 18 meeting, or it was but it had to do with. She asked if we could describe what we meant by a true alignment of interest when we're doing lending.
I've heard you refer to it when you're talking about real estate agents.
Pardon me?
I said I've heard you refer to that term when you're talking about real estate agents that you're working with.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
Yep, and I mentioned to Carol that we would take a few minutes here and talk about what we feel is the true, what we mean by that, and then what are some ways. And I'll just start by saying that I believe that in this business, as a lender, if we're doing the equity share in the back end, the more, and it really belongs to any business or any effort that we work on, the more that we can get everybody aligned and pulling in the same direction with a project or with whatever it might be, whether it's in the corporate world or if it's in real estate or whatever it might be, have the same alignment of interest. And just one example of that I'll use, and that would be a broker. One of the things I have a little bit of a challenge with is relying solely on a broker for doing due diligence on a project, unless that broker gets paid on the back end out of the profits, if there are profits on the deal, because it's not a true alignment of interest if that party is helping with due diligence up front and they get paid before the project is completed. It's a better alignment of interest, in my opinion, if that compensation comes in the back end. And I would say that it should be a higher compensation, at least in my opinion. It would be a higher compensation than normal if it's put on the back end, because it's reducing the risk to everybody else in that project. So that's one example. Anybody want to share their thoughts on that?
Well, I think anytime you've got, the more people you have that have a vested interest in the project, in the success of the project, we're all working for the same end goal. So everybody's role in the project is to make it the most profitable that it can be, get the project done on time, to, as far as like, what Bo and I do, mitigating the risk to make sure that the project is successful. And I'm not sure exactly when you were talking about real estate brokers, or you said brokers, and I didn't know if you meant real estate brokers, but I know a lot of the challenges are that I've been hearing, and we actually had this discussion with a few of the A-team members on Saturday, that the project went really successful, and now they're in the marketing phase, and they've got real estate agents or brokers marketing these properties that have no vested interest and are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It seems there's no sense of urgency. They're either not staging the properties, and the lenders are trying to coach these brokers into, okay, maybe we could do this, maybe we should be doing this, And again, you know, time is our worst enemy, as you've always said, Tom. So it's a little frustrating when you don't have control necessary over the broker. In that case, marketing the property, but because again, they have some vested interest, they want their commission, but how do you control that? How do you get that right alignment up front?
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned it. The way we do it at GCA, we work to the extent as much as possible where everybody, we as lenders for our investors, we're the last ones to get paid, right? So our investors get paid first. You as project managers, you help on the front end due diligence and make sure that it's a very good viable project, because a lot of the compensation for what you're doing is on the back end. So that is a better alignment with the end result that everybody is aiming for. So whereas if everybody just got paid up front and the project finished up and there's no profits, then everybody else has gotten paid, and whoever is left on the end is not paid. So that's what I mean about the alignment of interest. Woody Woodcock had a project about a month ago where it was a classic example of aligning the interest, because he had a project where the real estate agent that was selling the property was absolutely convinced that that was a perfect deal for Woody to invest in. And he said, you're going to make all kinds of, just went on about it. And so Woody and I were talking. I said, well, why don't you test him? Just tell him that you're willing to do it so that half of his commission, I think it was half of the commission, gets paid up front, but the other half gets paid on the back end. And there's a bonus on the other half on the back end if it really performs like he said it will. And the agent just totally backed out. He would not do it because, and I believe it was because he didn't believe in the project enough to put his own skin in the game or money on the line to make it happen. And so the more we can shift everything so it's really grouped together with the risk level all as ideally as close as possible, the better. And that's why when we set up our projects, we set them up in the way that the project pays all of the expenses. Because once everybody's been paid for what they bring to the deal, then what's left over is the profits, then that part can be split up. But making sure that, again, that you want to be able to be on either side of the fence, in my opinion, when you're trying to structure deals or when you're working with different people that are involved in the trail of the business. Andrea, do you have any comments, any thoughts?
Yeah, like one thing that we had a conversation with a general contractor here, because he normally, we talked about doing a SAM with him in Colorado, because money's pretty cheap here, but his problem is that he is tired of making the payments. His payments are a lot of money. And so one of the things that he looked at is, what did the project work if he could put his contractor fee in there, and it didn't. And at the same time, he was still considering it because, again, there was value in him not having to make these huge payments every month at the hard money broker he typically goes through. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, he sees the value in different people being involved and getting paid on that back end. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing, too, that he does with his realtor, where there's bonuses, if they sell within a certain amount of time. And so enticing the people that are participating to perform what they need to do by paying them a little more will make everybody more money in most situations. Not all the time, but in most situations.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I have to bow out early. It's my wife's birthday, so I'm going to say good night to everyone. And Bo, I know you have access to the questions. If you could take over and do that would be great. Much appreciated.
Bye, Mary.
Next week. All right. Take care.
Tom, there's all kinds of ways to align interests. I heard an interesting one recently. I met with a guy who had like 6 projects in San Francisco. That one of them was $1 million rehab. Mm-hmm. So the way he aligned interests, that he would actually, because there were substantial profits to be made, he actually hired a contractor and gave a piece of the back end to that contractor.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who was a businessman. He had a fairly substantial environmental business, waste management business or something, and he was doing these projects and making, a lot of money on the side by basically delegating it out, aligning interests, making sure he didn't have any problems, and he could, run actually 2 companies by doing that.
Yep. Absolutely, and I'm definitely a fan of subordinate seller carryback for that exact reason, right? So, if the seller of a property truly believes that his property is worth what as much as he's telling that the buyer that it's worth, if he's willing to subordinate some of his equity on the back end of it, which is exactly what you said, Bo, or it's very similar because he's taken some of the equity and compensating him with that. I think that's a test of true balance. So, anybody else want to share on that one? Do we have any questions on the queue?
I'm just looking through. I'm catching up with Barry left off.
Andrea, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
I really believe that if you can get this alignment of interest down, I think it's one of the ways to make your projects more successful than anything. Because if, like Mandy said it well, if everybody involved in that project has an interest in it coming out the back end, they're going to do their work better to make sure that that project is successful. So I'm happy that we took some time to go over this today, because I just think that it's important for people to comprehend and get what we're talking about, and exactly what you said about Woody's deal, the fact that that agent, because agents are coin operated for the most part, you put coins in and they operate, right? And to find an agent who will bet on what they're telling you up front is rare.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's not to say they're not out there. I've met some that are, but man, they're hard to find. And so that's the way to call them on that BS, I think, is say, well, you think this is such a great deal, then you get some of your money on the back end, and I'll pay you a little more for it. And if they say no, why not? That's a big red flag to me. And there's a lot of ways to get to that, with different people involved in the project.
And I think as lenders, it's really, if we are really getting involved to the point where we're sharing in some of the back end, sharing in the profits, I think it's part of our responsibility too to make sure that we're protecting everyone as much as possible in that project. And there's no better way, in my opinion, than to get everybody going in the same direction and balancing that risk on the back end. And it's a motivation, like you said, to get to that same end result that you want from everyone, and it usually makes the projects go better. Bo, anything?
There was a couple questions here. Could you use an option and record a memorandum of option as a way of getting your foot in the door for permitting before you actually own the property?
That's a really good question. I think my guess is it would depend a lot on the municipality. Anybody here have any actual experience with that?
I know an option does give you some control over property. I think they would probably have to recognize it as. And
did I hear recorded?
Recorded memorandum of option.
I think that's a great idea.
You probably don't even have to record it. If you can get a lease option for a period of greater than 3 years, any lease over a period longer than 3 years is a defensible interest in that property in a court of law. So if you have a lease for, say, 3.5 years, and you just tell the owner, I have to have that to have a stake in this property, to be able to do this, they should have, and you may have to fight with some of the municipalities about it, but they would be wrong. because if I have a lease over 3 years, by law, I have a right to that property.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Andrea. That's from an attorney to hear that.
Woohoo!
A great nugget. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Bo, Mandy, we're going to have to keep that in mind when we're trying to figure out how to do some of these deals.
I'll add it to the checklist.
Yeah,
One more box.
what a good way to wind down our session here. Anybody have any last comments that they want to share before we wind it up? We're finishing up an hour here.
I would like to invite everybody to our Jumpstart call. It starts in about 30 minutes. And Mandy and I are going to be talking about some due diligence on Due Diligence 101 is what we're going to call it, and just kind of have a quick overview on basic due diligence on the borrower and the property, and give a lot of time for you to ask questions. This is going to be a great question and answer session. I've already had some people call me and ask me about questions, and I've directed them back to the call so that everybody can hear the answers. So be sure to join us, and I'll give you the phone number real quick. It is 712-432-3022, and then the dial-in number is 740-689#. So y'all join us in 30 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Andrea, any parting thoughts?
No, thank you guys very much for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks
really
for joining
appreciate
us.
it.
Welcome, thanks.
Mandy, Bo, anything?
No, I just think it was exciting having 3 females.
Woohoo!
Girls really know what they're talking about.
We're outnumbered, Bo.
Yeah, we're building our team, I tell you.
It's our evil plan. We're taking over.
Okay, that's all right. You want the keys? No.
So what?
All right. Well, Bo, did you have anything to share before we part?
No, I'm good. I'm
All
good
right.
until next week.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. And if anybody on the call has any requests for things for us to cover on these calls, if anybody is open to volunteering, Jennifer, I know that Kim had volunteered to be on a session, so
I have her down for next week if she can
all
make
right.
it.
Right,
Yeah.
and anybody else? I think there were a couple of others that may have as well. So
Okay.
appreciate
Just let me
everybody that's
know.
joined us. And until next week, happy lending.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.